Like when you went and invested $50,000 without telling me?
Oh, damn.
I did inform her.
Jenny Slatten has forgiven Sumit Singh for things that would have ended most relationships years ago. She forgave him for introducing himself under a fake identity when they first met online. She survived the shock of discovering that he was already married. She moved across the world, fought through years of resistance from his family, and built an entire life in India around a relationship almost nobody believed would survive. But this latest confession may hit differently, because this time, there was no secret wife standing between Jenny and Sumit. There was no immigration obstacle. There was no question about whether his parents would allow them to marry. There was no forbidden romance that could explain why Sumit felt trapped between two different lives. This time, the secret came from inside the marriage they fought so hard to protect. Sumit revealed that he had taken roughly $15,000 to $20,000 in loans without Jenny fully knowing what was happening. And when Jenny heard that number, she wasn't reacting like somebody who had simply discovered another household bill. She reacted like somebody hearing the same old alarm going off again. Another secret, another major decision, another situation where Sumit knew something important about their future while Jenny was operating with incomplete information. And that is why this story is bigger than debt. The question isn't simply, can Jenny and Sumit pay back $20,000? The real question is much harder. Why did Sumit believe hiding the financial truth was easier than telling his wife what was happening? Why are they still struggling financially after everything they have been through? How much of this comes from his responsibilities to his parents? How much comes from poor planning? And after Jenny has sacrificed so much of her independence to make this marriage work in India, how many more secrets can she realistically absorb before love stops being enough? Because maybe Jenny and Sumit's biggest problem was never his parents. Maybe it was trust. And that is what makes Sumit's loan confession so important. On 90 Day, the last resort, the immediate issue was straightforward enough. Sumit acknowledged that there were significant loans, somewhere around $15,000 to $20,000, and Jenny made it clear that she had not understood the full financial situation. The money also connected back to why they were still living with his parents instead of moving back into a completely independent household. But if we stop the conversation there, we miss almost everything interesting about this. Debt happens. People borrow money. Couples get into financial trouble every day. Sometimes somebody loses a job. Sometimes rent becomes impossible. Sometimes family expenses appear. Sometimes a business goes badly. Sometimes people underestimate what they are spending. None of that automatically means a marriage is toxic or doomed. The problem starts when one partner knows the real financial situation and the other person doesn't. That changes the relationship. Because now, you don't just have debt, you have information inequality. One person is planning with the truth, the other person is planning with a version of reality that is already outdated. And that difference matters enormously for Jenny. Think about how much of Jenny's life in India depends on Sumit. She moved away from her own familiar environment. She is not surrounded by her own children, her own social network, her own language, her own transportation habits, or the kind of independence she would naturally have in the United States. That doesn't mean Jenny is helpless. She clearly isn't. This is a woman who has repeatedly made huge decisions and fought for a relationship even when everybody around her told her it was impossible. But practical dependence is still practical dependence. If you are living in another country and your spouse understands the local language, local systems, family network, transportation, housing options, financial structure, and social expectations better than you do, then transparency becomes even more important. You need reliable information because your ability to make independent choices depends on knowing what is actually happening. And that is why the loan revelation probably felt much bigger to Jenny than Sumit may have expected. He may have heard, I borrowed money because we were struggling. Jenny may have heard, you made another major decision affecting my future without including me. Those are not the same conversation. And this is where Sumit's history becomes impossible to ignore. Not because every new mistake should automatically be treated like the original catfishing situation. That wouldn't be fair. People can change. Relationships can evolve. A bad decision today does not necessarily prove somebody has the exact same motives they had years ago. But history changes how new information lands. If your relationship began with deception, then honesty later becomes more important, not less. Jenny's entire relationship with Sumit started with a false identity. He originally presented himself as Michael Jones. Then, later, Jenny discovered that the relationship was even more complicated because Sumit had another marriage. The two of them survived situations that would normally make trust almost impossible to rebuild. And somehow, against all expectations, they did rebuild enough trust to stay together. That is why hiding financial information is so dangerous for them. Every new secret doesn't arrive alone. It brings all the old secrets into the room with it. Jenny isn't just asking, why didn't you tell me about these loans? Somewhere underneath that question is probably another one. How many times am I supposed to believe that this is the last thing I didn't know? And that is where this relationship becomes fascinating. Because Sumit does not always come across like somebody who is trying to destroy his marriage. That would actually make this easier to understand. If he clearly wanted Jenny gone, viewers could put everything into one simple category and move on. But that has never really been their story. Sumit has made enormous choices to stay with Jenny. He fought his family's resistance. He accepted years of conflict around their age difference. He married her despite the pressure. He has repeatedly said that he loves her. So the contradiction becomes more interesting. How can somebody fight that hard to keep a relationship and still make decisions that damage the trust holding that relationship together? One possible answer is conflict avoidance. And I think this is where viewers should pay very close attention. There is a difference between calculated deception and avoidance-based deception. Calculated deception is when somebody hides the truth because they are deliberately trying to exploit the other person. Avoidance-based deception can happen when somebody knows the truth will create a confrontation, so they delay the conversation. Then they delay it again. Then they try to solve the problem privately. Then the problem gets bigger. Eventually, the secret becomes worse than the original issue. That doesn't excuse the behavior, but it may explain why the same pattern keeps appearing. Sumit often seems much more comfortable managing immediate tension than creating a direct confrontation that could explode right now. If he believes Jenny will become furious when she learns they need money, maybe borrowing seems easier. If he believes telling Jenny about financial obligations toward his parents will start another argument about moving out, maybe he tries to handle it quietly. If he thinks he can fix the problem before Jenny discovers it, then in his own mind, he may convince himself that he is protecting the relationship. But that kind of thinking almost always backfires. Because when Jenny eventually discovers the truth, she isn't only angry about the problem. She's angry about the fact that she was denied the opportunity to understand the problem when it was smaller. And that's exactly what hidden debt does inside a marriage. It turns money into a trust issue. There is also another contradiction here that deserves much more attention. Jenny and Sumit moved in with his family, partly because money had become difficult. The basic logic was supposed to be that living with the parents would reduce pressure. They would have more support. They wouldn't have the same housing expenses. The family structure might give them breathing room. But then Sumit reveals that he still had to take thousands of dollars in loans. So now viewers naturally want to know something very simple. If living with the parents was supposed to save money, why did the couple end up deeper in financial trouble? That question matters because it suggests the loan is probably not an isolated event. It may be a symptom of a bigger financial system that isn't working. And this is where the CAF storyline becomes relevant without letting the video turn into a completely different subject. Jenny and Sumit also tried the family business route. The CAF was supposed to create income and possibly help stabilize their situation, but that business struggled. If your independent living situation becomes financially difficult, then you move in with family. Then you attempt a business, then the business struggles, then you discover secret borrowing. There is a pattern forming. The problem isn't one bad month. The problem is that they don't seem to have a stable financial foundation. And for Jenny, stability matters more now than it might have 20 or 30 years ago. This is something the show can sometimes dance around because the relationship drama is more entertaining than retirement planning. But Jenny is not a 25-year-old starting over. Her financial decisions have different consequences. If somebody in their 20s loses $15,000, that can be devastating. But they may have 40 years of working life ahead of them. Jenny doesn't have the same timeline. Every dollar she risks now potentially affects her security later. That doesn't mean Sumit should treat her like she is fragile or incapable. It means both partners should understand that their financial risk tolerance may naturally be different. For Sumit, borrowing money might feel like a temporary problem that can be solved over time. For Jenny, hidden debt may feel like somebody quietly changing the conditions of her future. And that difference needs to be discussed openly. Then we get to the family issue. Because money in Jenny and Sumit's marriage is almost never just money. It is tied to his parents. It is tied to where they live. It is tied to cultural expectations. It is tied to guilt. It is tied to loyalty. And it is tied to a question that has followed this couple almost from the beginning. When Sumit makes a major life decision, who comes first? Jenny, his parents? Or does Sumit reject the entire idea that he should have to choose? That third possibility is important. From Sumit's perspective, supporting his parents may not feel like choosing them over Jenny. He may see it as basic responsibility. He may believe that becoming a husband did not cancel his role as a son. And I think that deserves to be acknowledged, because reality TV can sometimes flatten cultural and family conflicts into very simple categories. It becomes evil mother versus innocent wife. Real families are more complicated than that. Sumit's parents eventually made enormous movement from where they started. They went from intense resistance to a greater level of acceptance of his marriage. Sumit may genuinely feel responsible for staying close to them now. He may see helping them financially as loyalty. He may believe living together is practical. He may even believe Jenny should understand why those responsibilities matter. That doesn't automatically make him wrong. But Jenny also has a completely legitimate argument. She did not move across the world to become a permanent guest inside somebody else's household. She fought for a marriage. She believed she was building a home with Sumit. And after all those years of being told she was the problem, being treated like she didn't belong, and waiting for his family to accept her, finally getting acceptance only to lose her independence would feel like a cruel trade. She wins the battle and somehow still loses freedom. That is why the loans cannot be separated from the living arrangement. If Jenny had her own money, her own transportation, her own home, her own strong local social network, and complete visibility into their finances, Sumit's secret borrowing would still be serious, but she would have more options. When your practical life is built around your spouse and your spouse's family, secrets become more powerful. That is the real imbalance here. Not man versus woman, not India versus America, not old versus young. It's the person with the local infrastructure versus the person who moved into it. It's the person who understands the financial situation versus the person discovering it later. It's the adult son standing inside his family system versus the wife who entered that system from the outside. And that is why Jenny's reaction deserves more than she's mad about money. She may be asking whether she actually has enough control over her own life. Now, the fan reaction to this has been interesting because people are not united at all. Some fans feel Sumit deserves the majority of the blame. Their argument is simple. Jenny has already forgiven too many major secrets, and hiding a financial obligation after everything they have been through proves that the basic trust problem never really disappeared. Those viewers look at the pattern and say, how many times does Jenny have to learn something important after the fact? And I understand that argument. If a marriage has survived catfishing, another marriage, family conflict, financial strain, and years of instability, then transparency should probably be the one thing both people treat as non-negotiable. But another section of the audience looks at Jenny and says she knew what kind of family structure she was entering. They point out that Sumit has always been deeply connected to his parents. They argue that Jenny cannot expect him to abandon those responsibilities simply because they are married. Some of those viewers also question whether Jenny fully understands how much financial pressure Sumit may feel trying to satisfy everybody around him. And then you have a third group. These viewers are skeptical of the storyline itself. Some fans online have questioned exactly how the loans were obtained, what the money was used for, why the couple continues experiencing financial problems after years of television exposure, and whether producers are emphasizing certain details to make the situation more dramatic. Those are fan questions and theories. They are not confirmed facts. And that's an important distinction. Reality TV viewers are smart enough to know that what we see on television is edited. Scenes are selected. Timelines can be compressed. Conversations can be presented in ways that maximize tension. But the show is edited does not mean we can simply invent our own answer to every missing detail. We don't know everything about their finances. We should not pretend that we do. What we do know is that Sumit revealed significant borrowing and Jenny did not appear to have been fully informed beforehand. That is enough to analyze. We don't need gambling syndicates. We don't need fake criminal cases. We don't need a $300,000 fantasy scandal. The real issue is already serious. And I think one of the most interesting questions fans are asking is this: would you be more angry about the amount of debt or about the fact your spouse didn't tell you? Because personally, I think a lot of people could forgive the first much faster than the second. If my spouse came to me before borrowing the money and said, "We're in trouble. Here are the numbers. Here are the options. This is what I think we should do," then even if I hated the decision, at least I would be part of it. But if I discover later that the money has already been borrowed, now I'm not participating in the marriage. I'm being updated about decisions somebody else already made. And that changes the entire emotional dynamic. It tells one partner, "You are not part of the decision-making process until I need you to understand the consequences." That is a dangerous place for any marriage, especially one with Jenny and Sumit's history. And that brings us to the behavioral pattern. If you look at the relationship over time, there is a cycle that keeps appearing. A crisis develops. Sumit does not immediately reveal the full situation. Jenny learns more later. Jenny becomes emotional because the problem is now both the original issue and the secrecy. Sumit apologizes or explains. The couple reconnects. Then another structural problem remains underneath. That doesn't mean every situation is identical. It means the emotional rhythm is familiar. The fake identity was obviously much more serious than a financial communication problem. His previous marriage involved completely different circumstances. Family opposition is another issue entirely. But they share one uncomfortable feature. Jenny often seems to receive important information after decisions or circumstances have already moved forward. And that creates a relationship where she is constantly catching up to reality. Imagine how exhausting that becomes. You finally think you understand the problem. Then another layer appears. You finally think the marriage is stable. Then another financial issue appears. You finally think the family conflict has improved. Then you discover that living with the family creates a different kind of tension. At some point, the question becomes less about each individual crisis and more about whether Jenny trusts Sumit's version of events the first time she hears it. That is incredibly important. Because once somebody starts wondering, is that the whole story? Every conversation becomes harder. You don't just listen. You investigate. You watch body language. You wait for another detail. You prepare emotionally for the possibility that the truth is still incomplete. And marriages cannot stay healthy forever in that state. But I also think we need to be fair to Sumit. It is possible that what viewers describe as lying sometimes comes from panic. It is possible he feels trapped between Jenny, his parents, finances, family responsibility, and the fear of another massive argument. Again, that does not make secrecy acceptable. But if the goal is understanding the relationship, instead of simply choosing a villain, then motive matters. Maybe Sumit's biggest weakness is not that he wants to manipulate Jenny. Maybe his biggest weakness is that he is terrified of immediate conflict. So he delays hard conversations until the consequences become much worse. That personality pattern is extremely common. Some people think avoiding an argument is the same thing as protecting peace. It isn't. Avoided conflict does not disappear. It collects interest. Eventually, you pay for the original problem, plus the secrecy, plus the resentment that developed while everybody was pretending things were fine. And Sumit's loan situation is almost a perfect example. If he had talked to Jenny when the financial pressure began, they might still have disagreed. Jenny might have been furious. She might have wanted to move. She might have questioned how much money was going toward his parents. She might have rejected the idea of borrowing completely. But at least they would have been fighting about one problem. Now they're fighting about the money and the secrecy. That is twice the damage. And there is another uncomfortable question underneath all of this. What exactly does Jenny have left that she is willing to sacrifice? She sacrificed geography. She sacrificed proximity to her family. She accepted cultural adjustment. She endured rejection. She accepted years of instability. She stayed through secrets that would have sent most people home permanently. Eventually, sacrifice stops being romantic. Eventually, it becomes the structure of the relationship. And that is the danger. If one person's role is always to prove love through endurance, then the relationship can slowly train that person to accept things they once would have considered unacceptable. Jenny's story has always been celebrated because she fought for love. But fighting for love and fighting inside a relationship are not the same thing. At some point, the question has to become, what has Sumit built that makes Jenny's sacrifices worth it? Not emotionally. Practically, does she have security? Does she have reliable financial information? Does she have independence? Does she have privacy? Does she know where they are going to live long term? Does she know how much money they owe? Does she know what obligations Sumit has toward his parents? Those questions are not very romantic, But they are the questions that determine whether a marriage survives after the dramatic love story ends. And that may be what Jenny and Sumit are finally discovering. They spent years battling external enemies. His parents, his first marriage, cultural judgment, public criticism, distance, age gap controversy. Those problems gave them something powerful, a common enemy. It was always Jenny and Sumit against something. Now many of those external obstacles are weaker, and suddenly they have to face each other. That can actually be harder, because when there is no villain outside the marriage, you cannot blame somebody else for every problem. You have to ask whether the relationship itself works. You have to ask whether the communication is healthy. You have to ask whether the financial system makes sense. You have to ask whether love has matured into partnership. And that is exactly where they seem to be. Later in the last resort, Jenny's struggle with Sumit's honesty doesn't simply disappear after the lone conversation. The outline itself notes that later episode descriptions continue to frame Jenny as struggling with Sumit's lies, which strongly suggests the confession did not instantly repair the damage. That matters, because confession is not the same thing as repair. Saying the truth after somebody discovers a problem is only the first step. Trust comes back when behavior becomes predictable. If Sumit wants Jenny to believe that this financial situation is different, then transparency has to become routine. Shared access to the numbers, shared decisions about borrowing, shared understanding of what they owe, shared boundaries around helping his parents, shared agreement about where they live. Without those things, Jenny may forgive this loan and still remain emotionally insecure. And then 6 months later, they could be arguing about something completely different that comes from exactly the same structure. Maybe it will be rent, maybe it will be another family expense, maybe it will be the CAF, maybe it will be caregiving. Maybe it will be moving out. The specific argument can change. The system underneath it stays the same. That is why I don't think the biggest prediction here should be, will Jenny leave Sumit? Reality TV loves breakup predictions because they create easy drama. But the more interesting prediction is whether their marriage can change its operating system. Can Sumit stop managing crises privately and start treating Jenny like a full financial partner? Can Jenny build enough independence in India that disagreements do not automatically feel like threats to her entire life? Can the couple set a clear boundary around Sumit's parents without forcing him into some dramatic choice between wife and family? And can they create an actual long-term financial plan that does not depend on another temporary fix? Because that is what they need, not another emotional promise. A system. They need to know what comes in every month, what goes out, how much debt exists, what amount, if any, goes toward his parents, what expenses belong to Jenny and Sumit as a household, what happens when a crisis appears, what level of borrowing requires both people to agree, where they intend to live, what happens if the family business does not work, and what financial independence actually looks like for Jenny. That might sound boring compared with screaming matches and dramatic reveals, but boring systems are what save marriages from dramatic crises. And if they don't build those systems, the future is easy to imagine. Jenny continues asking for more independence. Sumit continues feeling obligated to his parents. Money remains tight. A new expense appears. Sumit tries to manage it without creating another confrontation. Jenny discovers it later. She says, "You lied to me again." Sumit says he was trying to protect her. They fight. They reconcile. Then they repeat. That cycle can continue for years. And eventually the amount of money may not matter anymore. The relationship could die from exhaustion rather than one giant betrayal. That is the long-term danger. But there is also another possibility. Sometimes a crisis finally forces a couple to deal with something they have avoided for years. Maybe this lone confession becomes that moment. Maybe Jenny's reaction is strong enough that Sumit realizes he cannot keep separating financial decisions from marital decisions. Maybe therapy forces them to define what honesty actually means. Maybe they finally create boundaries with his parents that are specific instead of emotional. Not choose me over them. Specific boundaries. How much support? How often? Whose money? Whose decision? Where do we live? Who knows what? Those are solvable questions. They become impossible only when nobody wants to answer them clearly. And Jenny also has choices to make. If she stays, she may have to stop judging every new financial mistake only through the lens of Sumit's worst past behavior. That doesn't mean forgetting. It means deciding whether she genuinely believes change is possible. Because you cannot rebuild trust while permanently assuming the other person will always betray you. At some point, Jenny has has to decide whether Sumit is somebody who made another terrible mistake or somebody whose pattern makes financial partnership impossible. Those are two very different conclusions, and only she can decide which one she believes. That is why I think this story is so much more interesting than a simple headline saying Sumit secretly borrowed $20,000. The money is the trigger. The relationship is the story. This confession forces Jenny and Sumit to confront everything they thought they had already survived. The original deception, the years of family resistance, the power imbalance created by Jenny living in Sumit's country, the financial instability, the failed attempts at independence, the tension between marriage and parental responsibility, and the question they may have avoided for years. After fighting so hard to become husband and wife, did they ever learn how to function as equal partners? Because those are not the same achievement. Getting married proved that Sumit was willing to fight for Jenny. Financial transparency will prove whether he knows how to build a life with her. And Jenny's response will prove something too. She has spent years showing how much she is willing to endure for this relationship. Maybe the next stage of her story is not proving that she can endure more. Maybe it is deciding exactly what she will no longer accept. The debt can be repaid. $20,000 is serious, but money can be earned again. What is much harder to recover is the feeling that your spouse tells you the whole truth. Once that disappears, every number becomes suspicious. Every family obligation becomes threatening. Every new plan feels uncertain. Every promise needs verification. That is why this confession could matter long after the loan itself is gone. Jenny and Sumit spent years believing that if they could defeat the outside obstacles, they would finally get the peaceful marriage they wanted. Now the obstacles are increasingly coming from inside the relationship, and those are harder to fight because there is nobody else to blame. So here's the real question. If you were Jenny, what would bother you more? The fact that Sumit had roughly $15,000 to $20,000 in loans, or the fact that you were not fully informed about them? Would you see this as another difficult financial problem that a married couple can work through together? Or after the fake identity, the secret marriage, years of family conflict, and now another major financial revelation? Would the secrecy finally be the deal breaker? Because at some point, love is not measured by how many crises a couple survives. It is measured by whether they stop creating the same crisis in different forms.